As a Catholicism became normalized within Irish life outside Ulster, Kuzey İrlanda'ya verilen isim, there was little reason to use fiction to defend or protect it. Those who did tended to be priests who had worked outside Ireland for a time and who had a sense of the fragility of Catholicism in the modern world. Among them were R.B. O'Brien, an advocate of the ultramontanism of Pope Pius IX, and Joseph Dinham, who valorized the emotional bond between priests and people in Irish Catholic culture as a defense against attack. Canon Sheehan, the best known of such novelists, also valued that bond, but suspected its capacity to withstand the assault of modernity. The heroes of his fiction, many of them priests, thus find themselves torn between the bond and a middle-class intellectualism, though the strategy of embracing intellectualism in order to defend the faith often turns into an alluring obstacle to it. In Jeffrey Austen's Student, the eponymous hero moves away from his faith while his friend Charlie Travers comes to see the need for zealous Catholic laymen in Ireland, because the country is not living up to its great vocation as the Catholic nation of the West. Charlie is also a nationalist, though of a particular religious kind, identifying British values as a threat to Ireland and advocating a cultural quarantining of Ireland from Britain, which outside fiction was to become typical in Ireland for the first half of the 20th century. The Triumph of Failure is a sequel. Here, Geoffrey immerses himself in philosophy and gets a reputation for being a free thinker before his conversion back to Catholicism, while Charlie burns all his non-religious books and becomes a lay missionary, inveighing against the paganism of modern civilization before his own premature death. Central to his mission is an attempt to distinguish between a true and false intellectualism. What shall it be when the intelligence of Ireland, emancipated from the shackles of a false education, shall go forth to steer the world with the watchword, Christ or Rome? In spite of such enthusiasm for a militant Catholicism, however, the novel ends on a pessimistic note about whether Ireland can live up to such a vision. What made Sheehan's subsequent and largely unwarranted popular reputation for bland affability was his semi-humorous minor charade, in which the contentment and wisdom of the priest narrator is contrasted with the zeal and inexperience of his reforming curate. Most of the latter's initiatives end in disaster, including a fishing vessel designed to boost the local economy but which sinks. The curate ultimately learns the lesson from a paralyzed local woman that true sanctity is to be found in certain type of passivity, and that, as with Charlie Travers, defeat and even death are not inimical to a true Christian victory. Sheehan's return to intellectualism and its perils in Luke Delmage. Its priest hero begins his career with the certainties of his seminary education. He is sent to work in England, where he is overawed by the social refinement of the friends he makes there, and comes to believe that faith and intellect can easily be reconciled. However, his social pretensions and intellectual pride lead to disaster when one of his friends goes to found a new religion called Eclectic Catholicism, under what he claims is Luke's influence. In order to be saved, he has to purge himself of his Anglicization, abandon intellectualism, and return to simplicities of life and faith in Catholic Ireland. There, he looks forward to the creation of a new civilization founded on Spartan simplicity of life, and Christian elevation of morals, and the uplifting to the higher life, to which all the aspirations of his race tended. The blindness of Dr. Gray also acknowledges that intellectualism may be more of an instrument of modernity than a weapon against it. In Sheehan's last novel, The Graves of Kilmorna, Ireland is seen to be a place more of a selfishness than idealism. Sheehan's fiction thus ends on a pessimistic note, disappointed by the inability both of intellectualism and of Irish Catholic culture to resist the corrupting effects of modernity. And the new topic, Catholicism and the New Ireland, daha ileri yıllara gidecek şimdi. Though still somewhat in the tradition of the Catholic gentry novel, When We Were Boys by William O'Brien, is the first major example of the sort of novel, the social, political, and religious attitudes of which would become typical of the style of Catholic intelligentsia novels during the next 30 years. In these novels, what was derided as Ireland's new puritanical and Philistine establishment of lower middle class shopkeepers, farmers, and priests becomes the problem, succeeding the now largely defunct landlord class. This pessimistic analysis was balanced by the sense that the new establishment was far from secure and that these years, roughly 1898-1920, were a time of change and potential. This was the age of Gaelic League. Bu da önemli bakarsanız. Of the cooperative movement, of the Anglo-Irish literary revival, and even of hope for a more liberal spirit between the church itself, to which many intelligentsia novelists were committed. Catholic intelligentsia writers, a largely male group, believed that a new form of society was about to emerge and that their novels could make a contribution towards it. By defining what true Ireland was, a new Ireland might be born. During this time, the novel came to be seen as a vehicle for semi-fictional autobiographies of the struggle with Catholic Ireland for a new Ireland. These struggles, however, often ended in various forms of failure, as Catholic Ireland proved to be more intractable than had been imagined. This autobiographical dimension was the reason for the great success of Father Ralph by the former priest Gerald O'Donovan. The novel follows the education of Ralph O'Brien, a member of a relatively wealthy family, who becomes a priest of the fictional diocese of Bannerholm and then leaves the priesthood in disillusionment. The clergy, with a few notable exceptions, are boorish, unintelligent, and venal, and aligned with the interests of the stronger farmers and shopkeepers. Ralph is sustained by his friendship with a number of pastorally minded and intellectual priests and far-sighted laymen. One of the priests wants to build a church that feels and voices the aspirations of every man of goodwill in the world. Meanwhile, the editor of a radical newspaper hopes to make religion intelligible in the light of progress. Ralph's own efforts at reform, however, and especially the Club for Working Men, which he founds, are crushed, and progressive theology, which has sustained him, is condemned as modernism by the Pope. His suspension over the theology issue and subsequent departure from the priesthood are greeted with incomprehension by his clerical colleagues. If it was drink now, or woman, there would be some meaning in it, but the theology. The novel ends with Ralph on the boat for Holyhead, declaring, "I have found myself at last." The departure of the defeated reformer, but free individual into exile would become a standard plot resolution in such books. O'Donovan himself had been a nationally known progressive priest. His own departure from the priesthood had none of the climatic quality of Ralph's theological dispute. After some successful years as an author, much of the rest of his life was to be spent in a disappointing lassitude. In Waiting, O'Donovan moves over the same territory as his previous novel, though this time from the point of view of a layman. Maurice Blake, in conflict with his tyrannical and ambitious parish priests, Fr. James Mahon is suspicious of almost everything, from the Irish language movement to agricultural improvement. Blake loses his job as a teacher when he marries a Protestant without the requisite ecclesiastical approval under recent papal decree. Notamere O'Donovan brings the novel to an almost histrionic climax when Blake loses an election to Parliament and Fr. Mahon refuses the last rites to an old friend who had supported Blake. Towards the end, the novel moves in direction of satire, especially in the description of the priests who are brought in to preach against Blake's candidacy. Earlier on, though, O'Donovan shows an interest in delineating Blake's complex reaction to expressions of religious faith which appear naive to a person of his educational level. Thus, when he is given a religious medal, he tries to throw it away, but then keeps it. He felt angry and sought round in his mind for a cause, not with the superstition. That was even interesting. There might be a good deal of folklore in that. The satiric trend in Donovan's writing itself, a sign of waning interest in battling the issues involved, reaches its apogee in Vocations, a hilarious account of convent life somewhat in the style of the young Evelyn Waugh. In their differing ways, Adolphe de Bullock, Patrick McNeil yazarlara bakarsanız made contributions to Catholic intelligentsia fiction in the decade before Irish independence. They were preceded by W. P. Ryan, a radical journalist who was the kind of religious and social reformer whom O'Donovan imagines in his novels. One of Ryan's newspapers was closed under pressure from the Archbishop of Armagh. Eser adlarına da bakarsanız. Ryan's hero is the editor Fergus O'Hagan, a thinly disguised self-portrait who mixes with theosophists, altruistic industrialists, and reforming priests interested in social Christianity and immanentism, a central tenet of theological modernism. An important concern of the novel is the need for a real intellectual engagement with religion, as one reformer laments. A man with a fair intellect must really turn away in despair or weariness from the majority of Irish sermons and the generality of stuff that is called Catholic literature. This is confirmed by the sinister bishop who warns O'Hagan of after the publication of an unsound and un-Irish article. The bishop privately admits that the article is bold and cruelly true. Our religion in Ireland has been emotional and in a measurement sentiment, but education will disturb the social order. And O'Hagan stands in the way of episcopal and British and Vatican policy in Ireland. He ends with almost risible menace. We can generally do it in a quiet way. It is seldom necessary to hit an editor very hard. Though ultimately defeated, O'Hagan remains in Ireland in a sort of internal exile, rendered possibly by his immanentist views. The great island is in ourselves, and it is full of beauty, divine activity, and boundless hope. The outer island, agitated or stagnant, is something incidental to keep our souls in training. Evet, gelecek haftada Moore ve Joyce üzerinde gidelim. Bunlar daha önemli yazarlar. Bu haftalık dersimiz bu kadar sevgili kardeşlerim. Gelecek hafta tekrar sizlerle görüşmeyi umut ediyorum. Kendinize dikkat ediniz. Aman dışarı fazla çıkıp da şu musibet hastalığa kendimizi kaptırmayalım. Evlerimizde kalalım. Esenlikler diliyorum. Hoşça kalın.